The legends rarely tell the same story twice. This is just one of them. Every civilization has its monsters. Creatures that hide in the darkness, creatures that hunt, creatures that kill. But across thousands of years, one creature keeps returning, not in one culture, not in one religion, but across entire civilizations, always waiting, at the edge of death. Not a dragon, not a giant, not a god, a dog. Why? Empires rose and fell, languages disappeared, gods were forgotten. Yet this image endured, a silent dog, watching, waiting, at the place where one journey ended and another began. The Greeks imagined it before the gates of Hades. The Persians placed two sacred dogs beside the bridge every soul must cross. And across Britain, people whispered that if you met a great black dog alone at night, something had already begun. Different lands, different beliefs, different histories, yet somehow the same creature. At first glance, it makes no sense. Stories travel, empires spread, legends change. But when the same image appears in civilizations separated by centuries and by thousands of miles, the question changes. Not, where did the story come from? But, why did so many people imagine almost the same creature? Perhaps we've been asking the wrong question. If we want to understand the Hellhound, we have to forget everything modern fiction has taught us. Because the creature most people imagine today, a demon born in hell, is surprisingly recent. The oldest stories describe something far stranger, not a servant of evil, not a beast that hunted the innocent, but something whose purpose has been forgotten. A figure standing where no living person could remain, at the boundary between life and death. That idea appears too often to dismiss as coincidence. But before we follow that trail into the ancient world, there is one story we have to begin with. Not because it is the oldest, but because it shaped the image most people still carry when they hear the words, Black Dog. August, 1577. The small village of Bungay in eastern England. It was Sunday. The church was full. Outside, a violent storm rolled across the countryside. Thunder shook the walls, rain pounded the roof. Then, according to those inside, the church doors burst open. Out of the darkness came a huge black dog. Its eyes burned like fire. It rushed through the congregation. People screamed. Some fell to their knees, others tried to flee. Before it vanished, 2 people were dead. Many believed they had witnessed the devil himself. The story spread rapidly. The creature became known as Black Shuck. For centuries, travelers claimed to encounter it on lonely roads, beside forgotten churches, and across the mist-covered paths of East Anglia. Some believed its appearance foretold death. Others insisted it never attacked at all. It simply watched, waiting. But whatever Black Shuck was, it was never the beginning. By the time the people of Bungay claimed to see their black dog, the legend was already ancient. If Black Shuck was not the beginning, where should we look? One obvious place to continue is ancient Greece. It seemed obvious. A monstrous dog, standing before the realm of the dead, Cerberus. But the deeper we look, the stranger the story becomes. Cerberus, the monstrous hound of Hades, the guardian of the underworld. At least, that's how most people remember him. A 3-headed beast, a serpent's tail, a creature so terrifying that even gods respected him. But like so many ancient myths, the deeper we look, the less familiar the story becomes. Because Cerberus is not the beginning of the Hellhound. He may be one surviving expression of an idea far older than the sources that preserve him. The earliest surviving description comes from the Greek poet Hesiod, writing around the 8th century BC. Surprisingly, the Cerberus he describes doesn't have 3 heads. He has 50, an impossible creature, something that belongs more to nightmare than mythology. Only later did poets and artists settle on the familiar image of 3 heads, the version that has survived into the modern world. Yet despite those changes, one thing never changed. Cerberus was never the ruler of the dead, he was their guardian. That distinction matters. He passed no judgment, he decided no one's fate. He wasn't an executioner, he wasn't a king. His duty was simple, to ensure that the boundary between life and death remained intact. Those who belonged among the dead stayed there. Those who still belonged to the living crossed that boundary, only under extraordinary circumstances. Once you see him that way, the famous myths begin to look different. Heracles didn't kill Cerberus. He overpowered him, dragged him into the world of the living, and then returned him to his post. The guardian remained. Orpheus never fought him. Instead, he played his lyre. For a brief moment, music achieved what strength never could. Even Aeneas, guided by the Sibyl, passed Cerberus not through force, but through preparation. She threw him a honeyed cake laced with sedative herbs. Cerberus devoured it and fell asleep, allowing the journey to continue. Again and again, the lesson is the same. The goal is never to destroy the guardian, it is to pass the guardian. That is a very different role from the one modern fiction usually gives him. Perhaps the Greeks never imagined Cerberus as evil. Perhaps they imagined him as necessary. Not a monster, not a demon, but the keeper of a boundary that could never be left unguarded. And once that possibility enters the picture, another question becomes impossible to ignore. If the Greeks imagined such a guardian, were they the first? Or were they preserving something far older? To answer that, we have to leave Greece behind and travel to the banks of the Nile. Because there, another civilization imagined a sacred canine standing between life and death. His name was Anubis. Today, he is often described as the Egyptian god of the dead. But that description is incomplete. Osiris ruled the realm of the dead and presided over judgment. Anubis was associated with embalming, protecting the deceased and guiding them toward judgment. To the ancient Egyptians, death was never an ending, it was a passage. The soul entered the Duat, the mysterious realm between life and eternity. A place filled with uncertainty, a place of trials, a place where every soul would eventually face judgment. But before that judgment, someone had to lead them there. That was Anubis. One of the most famous images from Egyptian mythology shows him standing beside the scales of Ma'at. On one side, the heart of the deceased. On the other, the feather of truth. If the heart balanced the feather, the journey continued. If it did not, the heart was devoured by Amit. But notice what Anubis never does. He does not decide the verdict. He does not condemn. He does not grant eternal life. That judgment belongs to Osiris. Anubis simply ensures that every soul reaches the moment where judgment can take place. The parallel is not exact. Anubis does not guard a gate like Cerberus. But once again, a canine figure appears at a crucial stage of the journey from life into death. At this point, it might still seem like a coincidence. After all, this is only our second ancient civilization. But then the pattern appears again, far to the east, in ancient Persia. And this time, the similarities become far more difficult to dismiss. Because here, we don't find one sacred canine, we find two, waiting at the final crossing every soul must one day face. The Chinvat Bridge. Every soul would one day stand before it. For the righteous, the bridge became wide, safe, easy to cross. For the wicked, it narrowed until it was no wider than the edge of a blade. One careless step, and they would fall into the abyss. But no one approached the bridge alone. Waiting there were two four-eyed dogs. Not monsters, not demons, guardians. The 4 eyes were not literal. Many dogs naturally have light-colored markings above their eyes, giving the impression of a second pair. To the ancient Persians, those markings symbolized supernatural sight. Nothing could deceive them. No soul could pass unseen. Dogs held such an important place in Zoroastrian belief that they became part of its funeral rites. One of these rituals was known as Sagdid, the gaze of the dog. After someone died, a dog was brought before the body. Its gaze was believed to drive away the corrupting forces associated with death and protect the funeral rite from ritual pollution. Once again, the pattern returns: a canine, standing at the threshold between life and death, not hunting, not judging, guarding. By now, the similarities are becoming difficult to ignore. Greece, Egypt, Persia. 3 civilizations, 3 religions, 3 sacred canines, each standing between the living and the dead. It would be easy to assume that one culture simply borrowed the idea from another. After all, stories travel, empires expand, people migrate, legends change. But then, the trail leads us even farther east, to ancient India. And suddenly, the mystery becomes even deeper. Because here, we encounter 2 more sacred dogs. Not merely similar, remarkably so. They are described as 4-eyed. They guard the road of the dead. And their story may preserve one of the oldest versions of this idea ever recorded. The oldest surviving reference appears in the Rig Veda, one of humanity's oldest religious texts, composed more than 3,000 years ago. There, we meet Yama. According to Vedic tradition, he was the first mortal to die. And because he was the first, he became the ruler of those who followed. But Yama does not stand alone. Watching the road to his realm are 2 dogs, the sons of Sarama, each described as 4-eyed, broad-nosed, ever watchful. Their role is not described in complete detail, but they are clearly guardians of the road the dead must travel. Even their appearance echoes what we have already seen in ancient Persia: the same 4 eyes, the same role, the same connection to the journey after death. That similarity is difficult to ignore. Ancient India and ancient Persia shared deep linguistic and cultural roots. Long before they became distinct civilizations, their ancestors shared a common tradition. Because of that, some comparative scholars have suggested that these guardian dogs may preserve fragments of an even older belief. And if that possibility is correct, then the story doesn't begin with Greece, or Egypt, or Persia. It reaches back toward a forgotten world, a world that left no surviving texts of its own, only echoes, fragments preserved inside languages, myths, and ancient rituals. For generations, linguists, archaeologists, and comparative mythologists have tried to reconstruct that lost culture. Today, we call them the Proto-Indo-Europeans. We don't know what they called themselves. We don't know the names of all their gods, and we don't know the stories they told around their fires. But by comparing the oldest traditions of the peoples who descended from them, certain patterns begin to emerge. One of them is difficult to ignore. Again and again, a canine. Not simply a companion, not merely a hunter, but a guardian standing between life and death. No surviving text tells us that the Proto-Indo-Europeans believed in a hellhound. That would go far beyond the available evidence. Some comparative scholars have proposed that these later traditions may preserve echoes of older Indo-European or Indo-Iranian beliefs. The evidence cannot reconstruct a single original myth, but it can reveal recurring structures, passed down, reshaped, and reinterpreted over generations. Not the story itself, but its descendants, like branches growing from the same forgotten root. And once that possibility enters the picture, everything we've seen begins to fit together. Perhaps these civilizations weren't simply copying one another. Perhaps they inherited different fragments of the same ancient tradition. A tradition whose original form has long been lost. But one question still remains. If these sacred canines were never meant to be monsters, how did the hellhound become a creature of hell? Today, The Hellhound is almost always portrayed the same way. A demon, a beast born in hell, a servant of darkness. That image appears everywhere, in horror films, fantasy novels, video games. It feels timeless, ancient, almost inevitable. But it isn't. The oldest traditions tell a very different story. Look back at every civilization we've explored. Cerberus, Anubis, the guardians of the Chinvat Bridge, the hounds of Yama. None of them exist to spread evil. None of them hunt the innocent. None of them rule the realm of the dead. Instead, they all protect a boundary. Without them, life and death would no longer remain separate. Perhaps that is why they appear again and again across the ancient world. Every civilization had to answer the same question: what happens after death? And just as importantly, who stands at the threshold? The answers were never identical. The names changed, the stories changed, the religions changed, but the image remained. A watchful canine, standing where one world ends and another begins. Over time, those ancient beliefs began to fade. Old religions gave way to new ones. Sacred guardians were reimagined as terrifying beasts. The unknown became frightening, and eventually, the guardian became the monster. The Hellhound was born, not because the creature had changed, but because our understanding of it had. Perhaps the real mystery was never whether hellhounds existed. The real mystery is why so many civilizations separated by thousands of miles and centuries imagined almost the same guardian. Was it coincidence? A shared ancestral tradition? Centuries of cultural exchange? Or simply different peoples trying to answer the same universal question? We may never know, but after following their trail across Greece, Egypt, Persia, India, and beyond, one conclusion stands out. The Hellhound was never just a monster. Long before it became a creature of hell, it was imagined as a guardian of the boundary between life and death. The monster came later. This is Voices of Mimir, where the oldest myths still whisper to those willing to listen.